We're entering the cathedral. Following our guide.
Sorry, back to you.
Excuse me.
Sitting down, listening to our guide now.
Well, looking around, you can easily imagine it took quite some time to build this church. I already spoke about the time it took to build it, 632 years. The first
632 years
architect,
to build it.
Gerhard von Rieder was his name. He knew he would never personally see it completed. Maybe his children, maybe his grandchildren, but even that would be optimistic. The least you needed for a cathedral in the Middle Ages was something like 60, 70 years. And in fact, when they began building in 1248, they needed 72 years just to complete the choir. The choir is the oldest part of the church. We're going to see that in a moment. When it was completed, it was already inaugurated as a small church of its own, separated to the construction site by a huge brick wall. But this was a long time the construction site. After the choir was completed in 1322, it didn't take too long until the first big crisis approached, not just for Cologne or Germany, for the entire continent, and that was the year of the Black Death in 1348. Bubonic plague, terrible disease, killed almost half of the European population. Small wonder people believed the end of the world had come. And that's why they interrupted the construction for approximately 6 years. After the worst was over, they began building again. And this time they kept at it for more than 100 years. Now the long nave was built, the foundations were completed, work on the southern spire on this side began. But unfortunately, in the course of the next years and decades, the trading conditions had changed. You see, when they began building in 1248, Cologne was still very prosperous. Biggest city, biggest market in Northern Europe, on the most traveled river of the continent. But in the meantime, in the next years, new trading routes have been discovered. To the Far East, the spice route, the silk route, and in 1492, very well-known date, America was discovered. And this was finally the time when the trading on the rivers was not so important anymore. Trading overseas, that was the new big business. Trading over the Atlantic to the New World and back. And if you wanted to take part in this new big business, you needed a seaport, something Cologne did not have. So Cologne was now a second-rate market, even lost the membership in the Hanseatic League, this powerful union of trading cities. It was now bypassed by a lot of the big trading routes, and this of course also showed on the budget of the cathedral. And so they had to continue with less money, less manpower, and they did well until the 16th century. But then finally came the death blow to the construction of the cathedral. And this death blow was dealt by a famous man, Martin Luther, the one who started the Reformation. See, he is indirectly responsible for the fact that the cathedral was not completed in this time, because he deprived the Catholic Church of its most important source of income. And this source of income had been for a long time a very clever system that allowed to forgive sins in exchange for money, something called indulgence. You've heard about that. It's not mentioned in the Bible. The idea that money can be spent for the forgiving of sins is not from the Bible. It was made possible by an invention of the monks of Notre Dame in Paris. They invented the purgatory. The purgatory is the place where all the sins have to be forgiven by suffering. All the souls have to go into the purgatory to cleanse themselves, to be cleansed before being allowed into paradise. And depending on your sins, it might be a long time in there, not a very nice place. People were very afraid, but of course a solution was offered. There was now, as they said, a treasure of the good deeds that the saints and Jesus Christ had done. And you can take part in this treasure by buying a part of it. Go to the church, pay the priest a certain amount of money. He will read you a mass, say some prayers for you, and that would save you time in the purgatory. The more money you paid, the longer the time saved. And this was excellent money, excellent income. It paid for the crusades, it paid for a lot of the cathedrals in Europe. But the problem, in the eyes of Martin Luther, it also paid for the luxurious lifestyle of the popes and the clergy. One pope, for example, had coined the phrase, "God in his grace and wisdom has made me his representative in this world, so I might as well enjoy it." And that's what he did. And a lot of his colleagues did likewise. The bishops as well, the clergy in general, they all spent loads of money on banqueting, palaces, the finest foods, the finest wines, good clothing, and so on. And this was fiercely criticized by Martin Luther. One pope in particular, for example, Pope Sixtus IV. You still know his name from the Sistine Chapel. He paid for that. He was one pope who always needed fresh money because he was what we would call today a patron of the arts. He had a vast family to provide for, an expensive army, and also a luxurious lifestyle. And that's why he even modified the indulgence business several times to turn out an even bigger profit. He made it, for example, possible to even buy indulgence in advance. So let's say you're planning a big sin 1 year from now, you have it forgiven already now. It was very practical, especially for the nobility of the time. You never know when you need to spare the indulgence in your pocket. It might come in handy. You also made it possible to get people out of the purgatory who are already in there. So let's say you have a sinful relative roasting in the fires of the purgatory. You can now bail him out with money from the inheritance. So if you had enough money, you didn't have to worry about purgatory at all. And that, of course, was not in the idea of the matter. Fiercely criticized by Luther as well, when he put this famous paper on the church gate at Wittenberg, the spark that fired the Reformation, you might say. His main criticism was the corrupt indulgence business of the popes in Rome. And his idea spread over Germany and Europe as well. And over the years, people were no longer willing to pay for that, meaning the money was lost. And this was a big financial crisis for the church. And it also had other consequences. In 1530, the construction site here in Cologne was flat broke. No more money to continue. They just abandoned the entire project when the cathedral was only half completed. The choir was complete, after all, still active as a church, but the long nave here was only half completed. The roof was made of wood, just provisorical, and the southern spire was only completed up to a height of 150 feet. Today, 480. The other spire was not there at all, just the foundations. So the cathedral stayed a construction site. Distinctive mark of Cologne now became a huge wooden construction crane standing on top of the uncompleted southern tower. One of the big cranes of the Middle Ages, almost 80 feet tall, and people got used to the sight of the crane and the sound that it made when the wind was blowing, and they had to because the crane stayed up there for 280 years. Almost 3 centuries, nothing happened. The cathedral almost fell into ruins, almost no one took care of it. But then came the 19th century, and with it the salvation and even the completion of the cathedral because of a new political situation and a new fashion. Politically, Germany had for the first time united in a way in the wars against Napoleon, against France. And now the Rhineland became part of Prussia, and the Prussian king had the idea to complete this church as a symbol of national unity, also for a symbol of unity of Protestants and Catholics in Germany. in spite of the Prussian king being a Protestant himself. And the fashion of the time helped. The leading power in literature, in music, in poetry were the so-called Romantics. And Romantics loved the old times in general. Medieval times, antique times, tales about knights and dragons. It was a time of the Wagner operas, it was a time of classic poems, and also the first Rhine cruises. They were made at the same time because of the abundance of medieval monuments in the Rhine Valley. And so the cathedral here was also back in the focus of public attention, and people donated private money for it. And by 1842, they had gathered enough with the government money. The second cornerstone was placed in 1842. New machines, new technologies made it progress a bit faster. And in 1880, it was finally complete after 650